In the Torah, we can find two kinds of explanations that are given for the dates of holidays. We can find agricultural explanations, and we can find historical explanations. Pesach, Passover, is supposed to be at the time of the first harvest, the barley harvest, and it is also supposed to be at the time when our ancestors left Egypt, according to the book of Exodus in the Bible. Shavuot, Pentecost, is given both an agricultural explanation in the Torah, the time of the wheat harvest, and the rabbis also gave the holiday a historical explanation, saying that the Torah was given in the month of Sivan at the same time of year as the wheat harvest, and that is the correct timing of the holiday according to the dates that we can find in the book of Exodus. The holiday of Sukkot appears at the end of the harvest of the fruit in the land of Israel. That part of the explanation works very well, but the historical explanation that's given in the Bible is that Sukkot is to commemorate the booths that Israelites lived in after they left Egypt as they were wandering through the desert. The problem is, of course, that the Israelites, according to the Torah, left Egypt in the spring, and that's why we celebrate Pesach in the spring. That's why Passover is in the spring. So if Passover is in the spring because that's when the Israelites left Egypt, then it would make sense that Sukkot ought to be in the spring also. And so we should be living in a sukkah. We should be building a hut, a booth, in the spring and not in the fall. Curiously, in the oldest rabbinic text, no one deals with this problem of why is Sukkot actually in the fall when the historical explanation has nothing to do with the fall. But in this recording, I'd like to deal with three suggestions that were made by great rabbis in the Middle Ages of how to deal with this problem. And with your permission, I will deal with them not in a chronological order, but I will save my favorite solution as the last solution. Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, also known as Nachmanides, who lived in Christian Spain in the 13th century, moved to the land of Israel towards the end of his life, offers two different explanations about why it is that we observe the holiday of Sukkot in the fall when we consider the historical explanation for it. And I'll read to you in English translation what he says. God commanded that at the beginning of the summer season, meaning in the spring actually, that at the beginning of the summer season we are to remember the exodus from Egypt by calling that month the first month and by observing the holiday of Pesach then. And he further commented the remembrance at the beginning of the rainy season of the continuous miracle which was done for them throughout their stay in the wilderness. So Ramban's first explanation is that it's kind of spreading out the commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt over all of the seasons, and that's why in the spring we commemorate the leaving of Egypt, and then the fact that the Israelites were miraculously able to survive in the wilderness for 40 years, as the Bible says, living in these sukkot, living in these huts. We commemorate that in the fall, which is a way of spreading out the celebration and the commemoration over the entire year. Okay, that's explanation number one that Ramban offers. And the second explanation that he offers is that the Israelites in the wilderness began to make Sukkot only at the beginning of the winter on account of the cold, as it is customary in camps like military camps, and therefore God commanded that we also make them at that time. I guess Ramban's second solution says that the Israelites, after they left Egypt, were able to live in the wilderness in the summer months, camping out in the open. But when the weather started to turn and become less pleasant, then it was necessary to build Sukkot. So since the Israelites in the desert built Sukkot only in the fall, that is why Jews of later generations observe the holiday of Sukkot in the fall. Another great medieval rabbi who lived in Spain, Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century, wrote works called the Tur, and he is sometimes referred to as Baal HaTurim. And in his halachic work, in his work of Jewish law, he offers an explanation that in some sense is almost the opposite of the explanation that Ramban gave. The reason that that Jews are told to live in a sukkah in the fall is, even though, I'm reading to you from his work in English translation, even though we left Egypt in the month of Nisan, God did not command us to make Sukkot in that season, since Nisan comes at the beginning of the warm months when everyone makes a hut for shade. If we made Sukkot at that time of year, it would not be obvious that we were building them in order to fulfill a commandment from God. And that's why God commanded us to make Sukkot in the 7th month, in other words, in the month of Tishrei, September, October, which is the rainy season when most people would be leaving their hut and moving into their homes. But we Jews do the opposite. At this time of year, we leave our homes and we dwell in a sukkah in order to show everyone that we are fulfilling a royal commandment. In other words, a divine commandment that God the King has commanded us to do this. In other words, it makes no logical sense to be living in a sukkah in the fall. People go outside in the spring and in the summer, in the nice weather, they eat their meals outside, dining al fresco, but we don't do things like this generally in the fall when the rainy season is beginning. And so that is why the Torah said that we should do it specifically at the time that most people wouldn't be doing it, so it would be very clear that we are doing this for the sake of observing God's command and not because it's pleasant to eat outside. I would say that most of us who have lived in Canada and tried to observe the holiday of Sukkot in Canada in October might be able to feel for the idea behind Rabbi Jacob ben Asher's suggestion. It's often not a very pleasant time to be eating outdoors. My father used to tell the story about his father in Winnipeg getting up on a ladder to push the snow off the roof of the sukkah so that he'd be able to see the stars at night. Didn't want the snow on the roof to be blocking his view of the stars. I can remember sitting in a sukkah in Toronto with a heater on. So Jacob ben Asher says, well, this was done on purpose. The Torah commanded that Jews should be sitting in a sukkah specifically at a time of year when nobody would be deciding on their own initiative to be eating in a sukkah. As you may be able to tell from my voice, I'm thrilled with neither of these explanations, neither the explanation that was offered by Ramban nor the explanation that was offered by Jacob ben Asher. My favorite explanation was offered by Rashbam, by Rabbi Samuel ben Meir, who lived in northern France in the end of the 11th century and the beginning of the 12th century. And what Rashbam manages to do with his explanation is figure out a way of combining the agricultural explanation for the holiday of Sukkot and the historical explanation for the holiday of Sukkot. Rashbam's comment is a little long, but and it's a little repetitious, but I will read it to you, or at least read highlights of the comment to you in English translation. Rashbam writes, "This is the idea behind the text. You shall hold the Feast of Booths, the holiday of Sukkot, after the ingathering from your threshing floor and your vats." In other words, when you gather the produce of your land, and your houses are full of all good things, grain, wine, and oil, that is the appropriate time for you to celebrate Sukkot, so that you will remember that I made the Israelites live in booths for 40 years in the wilderness without any settlements and without owning any land. In other words, Rashbam is saying that at the time of the year when you, the ancient Israelite farmer, are gathering together all of your produce, and your house is filled with all sorts of good things, that is a time of year when you should be remembering the humble origins of the Jewish people, and the fact that there was a time when we didn't own any land, and when we were wandering through the desert, and we were dependent on God's good graces. In other words, the living in a sukkah in the fall is a corrective for the feeling that some ancient Israelite might have when he or she is feeling, boy, everything is going very well for me. I've just filled my house with produce, and I'm getting ready for the onset of the winter, and all is going well with me. This is the time to remember the Israelites' humble origins. Rashbam continues, as a result of contemplating this, you will give thanks to God who allows you to own your own land and your houses which are filled with all good things. And you will not say to yourselves, my own power and the might of my own hand have won this wealth for me. That, according to Rashbam, that is the major concern here, that the ancient Israelite farmer will think that he or she has succeeded because of their own efforts alone and not because of God's help. Rashbam continues, this is why at harvest time the Jews are to leave their houses that are full of all good things and live in huts, so that they will remember that in the wilderness they had no land which they owned and no houses in which to live. It is for that reason that God set the holiday of Sukkot at the time of the harvest of the threshing floor and the vat. In other words, at the time when all of the produce has been brought in, so that their hearts will not grow haughty about their houses that are full of all good things, and so they will not say, our own hands have won this wealth for us. Rashbam finds a creative way to combine the agricultural and historical explanations of the holiday. The harvest holiday of Sukkot comes at a time of year when ancient Israelite farmers would have been in their best financial position with houses full of produce. Jews accordingly move into a sukkah on this holiday as a corrective. Rashbam suggests they must, especially then, remember their humble origins so that they do not become overconfident. Rashbam connects Sukkot's historical and agricultural rationale, and it leaves us with what I think is an inspiring message. Financial success should not lead people to abandon the Torah. Jews should always remember our humble origins and realize that our successes are attributable to God. I wish all of you a very happy holiday and a happy new year, and Chag Sameach.